Okay, hello. Here we are again in Genova with UniNomade's meeting 2011. And here next to me in this table I have Sandro Mezzadra, who has been organizing this meeting. So, Sandro, as a first question I would ask you, what do you consider as the most important political struggle at the moment? I can hold it.
It's not a problem. You know, it is quite difficult to make a kind of hierarchical taxonomy of struggles. I think that we are confronted nowadays in an enlarged Europe with a multiplicity of struggles that are kind of rewriting the grammar of our political experience. You know, the financial crisis hit Europe basically last year. And since then there has been kind of continuous reproduction of struggles. We had the great social struggles in France at the beginning of the fall last year, but then students' struggles, think of the UK and Italy, that took the form of kind of uprising, you know, both in London and in Rome. You had and you have a continuous process of reproduction of struggles in Greece. But then you have had the enlargement of the front of struggles with the uprisings in the Maghreb and in the Mashrek, you know. Then you have Spain. And you have this circulation of struggles. Each struggle has its own peculiarity, specificity, but at the same time, I mean, it is impossible not to grasp the kind of common ground within which these struggles are developing. So I wouldn't propose a kind of hierarchical reading of these struggles. I would rather kind of underscore the fact that we are experiencing what I tried to describe in the meeting as the end of resistance. What do I mean when I talk about the end of resistance? I mean that we are kind of abandoning an era in which social struggles were forms of resistance against the neoliberal kind of restructuring of society, labor market, and so on. It is quite apparent to me that nowadays the struggles that I have mentioned as kind of examples are attempting to get out of a simple position of reaction to the initiative of capital and neoliberal governments, and are starting to build the common ground of an alternative. This is, of course, a very general kind of statement, but I think nevertheless it corresponds to the social experience of people who are struggling across this enlarged Europe.
Do you think that there should be an organization in that form that people would try to find a common objective, which would, for example, be basic income, la renta básica, as a form of a common ground? Do you find this necessary or interesting?
Well, I find organization absolutely necessary. But of course, when we talk about organization, we are not talking about a kind of eternal principle. We are talking about kind of forms, techniques of organization that have to be kind of reconceived in front of the novelty of the social composition of struggles, of the forms of struggles, of the kind of networks that are kind of underlying struggles and are already producing, for instance, a dramatic kind of circulation of languages, of behaviors, of forms of struggle. You were talking about renta basica, which is, of course, an important topic. But once again, I wouldn't say that what we need is a single kind of claim, that can work as a connecting tissue between different struggles. I rather think that we have to imagine a system of claims, in plural, that can give us the sense of the possibility of politically interpreting the kind of transition from resistance to constitution that we are trying to focus on. What is particularly important for me is precisely this, let's say, transnational dimension. This circulation of struggles between Tahrir Square in Cairo, Tunisia, and then Spain, and then Greece, and then England, and so on. Within the traditional left, there is a kind of temptation, kind of automatic reaction to the crisis that leads the traditional left itself to think of resistance to the crisis within the national framework. Well, I don't think this is effective nowadays. I think that precisely what we are experiencing in Europe. Let's take the Greece crisis. The Greece crisis is not a national crisis. It is a European and global crisis. And it is really very naive to imagine the possibility of overcoming the crisis or even capitalism within the boundaries of the Greek nation state. What we really need is kind of mobile assemblages of struggle and political initiative capable of combining different spatial scales. And one of these scales can, of course, be the national scale. But it becomes again meaningful only if it is inserted within a much more complex and multiscalar assemblage, assemblage of political struggles, political claims, and political imagination.
As the last question, I would ask you, how would you describe the idea of communism?
This is not an easy question. This is not an easy question because communism is not necessarily to be considered as an idea. Communism has been a real movement, as Marx put it in the 1840s. It has been a historical force. It has been precisely an assemblage of struggles, organization, and autonomous institutions. So I prefer to look at communism considering it not an idea, but rather a historical force, you know. And if I look at communism, considering it as a historical force, I have to say, first of all, that this historical force has declined, you know. And so it doesn't make sense to imagine communism nowadays in a kind of continuity with the history of communism. But secondly, I have also to say that the history of communism has kind of shaped the historical ontology of our present, has kind of shaped the genealogy of our present. The kind of interpretation of equality and freedom as the kind of interconnected two principles that has been historically produced by communism is a threshold. I mean, we cannot go back before this threshold. What we have to do is to reinvent this threshold, and I don't know if the word that we, the multitude, let's put it so, will use in order to reinvent that kind of combination of freedom and equality will be again communism. I mean, I like very much that word, you know. I like very much that word. If I have to define myself, I mean, the only way in which I can define myself is communism, is communist. I mean, precisely in the sense of this materiality, you know, of the connection between freedom and equality. But the connection itself was produced by subjects, you know, by a specific composition of labor, the class composition. I mean, the composition of labor nowadays is really different, is really completely new, you know. And so it is our bet for the future to reinvent that word, maybe with another word, but unless we find another word, I will continue to call it communism.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, really.